Today's lesson is converting between percents, fractions, and decimals. Now it says day 2, however, this is a 6th grade concept that we're just reviewing. So you guys should have no issues starting right here. You guys can go ahead and add the date to your paper. And the first thing we're gonna do is we're skipping that warm-up handout. And we're gonna go on to this review. We're just coloring in the grids to represent the fractions. Notice that each grid that you have is a 100 box. So the first one is 30 hundredths. All we do is color in 30 boxes, 10, 20, 30. The next one is 3 hundredths, so we're gonna color in 3 out of the 100 boxes. And then the next one is a third of the hundredths. So what we're gonna have to do is I know 1/3 is less than 1. So when I think about just a single box, I only want to color in a third of it. So I'm going to divide it into 3 equal pieces, and I'm going to color in just a little bit on top. And there we go. Whenever it's out of 100, we just color in however many numbers are on top. So when we think about what we just did, that percent, all a percent is a number out of 100. And so a fraction is a representation of a percent because it's a number over 100. That's all a fraction is. So a percent would be that number percent. So we have that relationship there. When we think about it's always out of 100 because the best score you could get is 100% on something. And so knowing that, we're gonna use this definition of percent and what it means to fill in this table below. Whenever we have a percent, in order to make a percent into a fraction, all you have to do is put the percent over 100. So we're going to go ahead and change all of these percents into fractions. 37.5% would be 37.5 over 100. 100% would be 100 over 100. And I know that can go ahead and simplify down to just 1 whole. My next one is 110%, so it'd be 110 out of 100. And we like to reduce our fractions, and I can see very clearly that these both divide by 10. So I would have 11 out of 10. Improper is fine. 1% is just 1 over 100. And then that 0.5%, just like what we did up in that third box, it's just a half out of 100. We then also have to convert all of these percents or fractions into a decimal. When I'm converting, I like to start with my percent. I know my percent to decimal. You move your decimal to left. And so if I'm starting with 37.5%, I take my decimal and I move it 2 to the left. That makes my decimal 0.375. If I take my percent, find my decimals at the end after that 100, I move it 2 to the left, it becomes 1.00. Move it 2 over, 1.10. Move it 2 over, 0.01. Now here's our issue. We can't put a half into a decimal, but I can think of a half as 0.5%. And then I have my decimal to move over to. Notice you become 0.005. It moves over into that thousandths place. And now we're not just starting with the percents. Now we're starting with a fraction, a decimal, or a percent. So when we think about what we know percent to decimal is we move the decimal 2 to the left. So if I wanted to go the reverse option, decimal to percent, it makes sense that we would move the decimal 2 to the right. We also know that a fraction is simply the percent over 100. So when we think about these things that we know, we can go ahead and fill in our table. When we start with the percent and we're going to a decimal, we would move it to left. So it becomes 3.50. I also know that for the fraction, I just take my percent and I put it over 100. Then if we can reduce, we want to, I can see they both divide by 10 to make 35 out of 10. And these both divide by 5, which would make 7 out of 2. Okay, all of those would be good answers. The next one, we're starting with our decimal. So I know right away I can go ahead and make it into my percent by moving it 2 to the right. So it becomes 2.5%. And once I know my percent, I can go ahead and make that fraction. 2.5 over 100. And then lastly, we're given 1/8. We need to put 1/8 out of 100 because it always needs to be out of 100. And in order to easily do that, remember we just cross multiply to figure out what will go on top. So we have 8 times something equals 100 times 1, which is 100. So when we divide by 8, we end up with x equaling 12.5. So 1/8 is really 12.5 out of 100. And if I know that, I know in my fraction that I have here, it's the percent over 100. So it's the percent is given to me now. My percent is 12.5%. And once I know that, I can go ahead and easily write my decimal by moving that decimal over to 0.125. So when we think about these conversions, we've already talked about all this, but now we can put all these in one spot. So going from the percent to decimal, we know that we move the decimal to left. That was the first rule we talked about. So then when we go from a decimal to a percent, we do the opposite. We'll move the decimal 2 to the right. Now, when we think about those percents that were more than 100, that was happening when the top number was over 100. So that's when we had something such like 350 over 100. Those things happen in real life when we think about the increase in price. When companies buy items, they buy it for $5, but they might sell it for $7. That's an increase of a percent that's more than 100. They're trying to make money. When a percent is less than 1%, that's when we have those fractions on top. So that 1/2 out of 100. 1/8 out of 100. And when that happens in real life, I always think about my gas prices. Gas prices are $1.05 and 9/10. This 9/10 right here is less than a penny or less than 1%.